Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be chatting about the Cuddle Up Sampler cutting instructions for our upcoming sew along. The sew along is going to be kicking off in just a few short weeks, so I wanted to take a little bit of time to go over some helpful tips and show you how I am going to be setting up my pieces as I cut them so that it is nice and tidy as we work our way through the pattern. If you're unfamiliar with the Cuddle Up Sampler, I have it hanging here behind me, and we are going to be making these blocks together in the upcoming months. Over on my blog, I have the calendar of blocks, the dates we'll be making them, along with the finishing instructions, so you can print a copy of this out if you want to. And if you are unfamiliar with the Cuddle Up Sampler sew along, I will also link to the blog post and the video where I originally chatted about this sew along. You will need a copy of the Cuddle Up Sampler pattern to participate in this sew along. I do have copies of this for sale in my Etsy shop. So if you want to sew along, make sure to grab one of them. These are also for sale in local and online quilt shops. So if you have a favorite quilt shop you would like to support, that would be wonderful. Let's take a look at some of these cutting instructions. Now, you might feel a little bit overwhelmed as you start to see exactly what we're going to cut, but I have set this pattern up in two different ways. You can opt to cut all of your fabrics ahead of time, which is what I'm going to do, or you can opt to cut just the pieces you need for each block as we work our way through the pattern. Whichever way makes more sense to you is the way that you should do it. I will, of course, be sharing my approach to the cutting, but please cut the way that it feels most intuitive for you to cut. As you work your way through the cutting instructions, you are going to see that I have laid out how the pieces that you need to cut from each fabric can be laid out with the sizes listed for each of these different prints. And these illustrations are to scale, so you can see how much fabric you will have left over on your pieces after cutting everything that you need. This is helpful to know for all of you pre-starchers. You can easily see that you are going to have enough fabric to pre-starch the print fabrics as well as your background fabric. So that is kind of an overview of how this looks. On the next pages, you're going to find the rest of the illustrations for the print fabrics as well as your background cutting information. Now, one thing that I will do sometimes is I will cut all of my background cutting first, because that is the least exciting part to cut. And oftentimes that's where you need to spend the majority of your time, is cutting those background pieces. So on the next page in your pattern, you can see all of those background pieces that you need to cut if you want to cut those first. Get all of those uninteresting cuts done, then you just have the pretty prints to work with after that. I will sometimes approach quilting that way, but that's up to you exactly which way you want to do that. Now, I did want to talk about straightening up your check fabrics, because I like to make sure that the checks are running nice and straight so that when we piece our blocks like this print right here, the check that you see is used right here in this quilt. So I like to make sure that everything is running nice and straight so that we don't have checks running in funny directions. So I wanted to talk about how to do that real quickly. Going to move this up here. I have my fat 8, which is 9 inches by 22. You're going to find all of those measurements listed so that you know which direction to lay out your pieces of fabric if it matters. So make sure that you pay attention to those. So I have my 9 inches running vertically, my 22 inches running horizontally. And then I want to straighten this up. Now, my fat 8 is not running too crooked, but I am going to make it just right. I'm going to use this bottom line right here as my guide. And what I'm going to do is trim a 1/4 inch below that line. And that is going to keep this check running nice and straight when I cut out this piece right here. So we'll just go ahead and do that. Yeah, He's being fussy with me today. Let's try that again. This is not a mat that I typically use. I have another whole cutting mat and setup upstairs in my sewing room, so I'm more used to working up there. All right, so I have the bottom piece right here, and then I'm gonna bring this down, line that up, and then I can trim off my selvage over here, and then it's going to be ready to cut that piece. So trim this selvage. And then we can go ahead and cut that piece that I need, which is 6.5 by 10.5. So just going to come up to the 6.5. Now you could cut out your piece exactly, you know, come across and come up and just cut out just what you need, so you'd end up with a larger piece of fabric here. I am going to cut the whole way across, which is going to give me a little bit less usable fabric, but this is the only piece that I need from this checked fabric. And then I'm going to slide this over so I don't accidentally cut that too short, and cut my 10.5 right here. There we go. And then these are going to be extra fabrics that we're not going to need in this project. And that is what the checked fabric looks like right here. And then that is ready. So this is the first piece that I have cut for my quilt. So I have quite a bit of cutting ahead of me. I am going to cut everything and get it all ready to go, and then show you how I organize my pieces so that they are easy to pull as we are making our blocks. So that's going to take me a fair amount of time. I'm going to touch base again in a couple days once I have that done. In the video, it's going to happen immediately, but for me, I'm going to be putting in some time cutting. So I'll be right back. And we are back. It has been a few days since I last chatted with you, and some cutting has happened. Actually, quite a bit of cutting has happened. I have everything cut out now for our sew along, and it was a good bit of cutting. It probably took me, I'm guessing, 5 hours or so to get everything cut out. So it is a lot of cutting to do ahead of time. And that might not be your thing, doing all of that cutting ahead of time. So I will share how you might approach this sew along if you prefer not to do all of that cutting right up front. But first I want to show you how I cut and labeled everything in preparation for the sew along. As you can see, we've got a stack of cut fabrics. I've got everything stacked up here. These are all the print fabrics. I didn't follow my own advice. I did cut all of the print fabrics first, and then I got to my backgrounds, and I wasn't too amped up about having to still cut all of those, but that's what I did. Anyhow, here are all of the prints. I have everything stacked up and cut. And I want to talk about how I cut these. So I'm just going to show you guys this floral print right here. So you can see your cutting diagram, how to cut everything here. And then as I cut my pieces, I labeled them and then either pinned just a little handwritten note with the measurements that I cut, or if it was a thicker stack of fabrics, I used a Wonder Clip to hold everything together. And then I just stacked all of these pieces up on one of these magazine backing boards. This is what they look like right here. You can get these on Amazon. You might be familiar with the comic book backing boards. I feel like those are mentioned fairly often in quilt making because people use them to fold their fabrics around to store on their sewing room shelves. I like this size. This is an 8.5 by 11 inch size, which is a little bit bigger than the comic book size, which is why I use those. And I have a lot of these on hand because I used to store my fabric, nearly all of it, in this method. I no longer store it the same way, so I ended up with a lot of these little cardboard backing boards, which I use for different purposes in sewing. And this happens to be one of them. So everything is laid out and organized on these little boards and labeled so that as we get to each new block, every time it's released, I have everything cut and labeled so I don't have to try to figure out what size my pieces are. And then the background fabric is the same. Everything is just cut and labeled and just sort of stacked up like so. Now, let's talk about how you can approach the cutting if you don't want to do all of this ahead of time. One really simple way, well, first of all, there's a couple different ways. Let me start out with, I'm going to give you two different options. You can see here how each block is set up. You have the block diagram, and then you have all of the pieces listed that you will be using to make each individual block. So you could very easily go through and cut just the pieces you need for that block. To keep things organized, if you choose to go that route, I would suggest cutting just your strips ahead of time. So if you didn't want to go to all of the work to cut each individual piece, cut the strips ahead of time. Let me show you what I mean. When you are looking at all of these little cutting diagrams, you're going to see that you could cut strips across of each of these prints. So for this print that we just talked about, you could cut one strip 3.5 inches, and that would take care of all of these pieces. Another strip 3.5 inches all the way across, and that's going to take care of all of those pieces. And then one strip 4.5 inches all the way across. And then that way you would have your strips already cut, and when it is time to cut the individual pieces from the block, you're going to see the print that you need listed in that block, and then you can just come through and look and see where we are cutting that from what size strip. That would be an easy way to keep everything organized. Have the strips cut ahead of time so that you are utilizing your fabrics nicely, and then you are just subcutting at the beginning of each block construction. The same would work for your background fabric, and you would just cut your subcuts. You see, not your subcuts, you cut your strips, which you see listed in the gray. So you need 2 strips, 1 inch by the width of fabric. Go ahead and cut all of those. And then 3 strips, 1.5 inches by your width of fabric. Go ahead and cut all of those. You can cut all of those measurements that are shown there in the gray bars ahead of time. And then when it comes time to cut your blocks, you would just subcut what you need from those pieces. That is going to still allow you to make use of the cutting information that I have included without having to go through all of the subcutting right up front. Of course, you could always opt to cut just the individual pieces that you need for each block as we get to it. So that's 3 different ways that you could approach the cutting. As I've done it here, cutting everything, subcutting everything, labeling everything ahead of time. Do a portion of the cutting ahead of time by cutting the strips, or simply waiting until we get to the block and cutting what you need individually for that specific block. I made a couple notes that I wanted to share. Let me see what I have covered already. On pre-starching, one thing I wanted to mention on that is if you pre-starch, some of these you might need to, like for example, this green holly fabric, these are to scale. So if you found that you were a little bit shy here, you might need to move your pieces around just a little bit. You can pre-starch everything. You do have enough room to pre-starch everything, but you might find on a piece or two of fabric that you need to just adjust a little bit where you cut that piece of fabric. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The polka dot fabric, I didn't mention this. I mentioned straightening up the checked fabric, but I didn't mention about the polka dots. That is another print that you might find you like to straighten up ahead of time. And I do that the same way that I do the checks. You just line things up nice and tidy and straighten it up so that everything is running nicely across the fabric. And I talked about pre-cutting strips if you preferred not to do all of this cutting right up front. So I think those were my main notes that I wanted to mention in regard to cutting. If you have questions about any of this cutting or how something might work, or I don't know, there's probably something I haven't thought about in regard to cutting. So if it has popped in your mind, be sure and let me know in the comments, and I will be happy to answer that so that you can start preparing for the sampler sew along. The dates are listed in that printable that I shared earlier in this video. So if you don't have that, make sure and print that out. And I can't wait to sew along with you very soon. So I am looking forward to that. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I will catch you again next time.